War never changes.
Or does it? Today we're going to explore the oldest evidence of human warfare, before power armor, before guns, before swords and perhaps even clubs had been fully developed, and look at what would have made caveman warfare so brutal. We'll cover what war looks like with Stone Age weapons, why prehistory seems so rife with violence, and whether we're better or worse for it nowadays. And to finish up, we'll look at the most ancient evidence of human warfare that we have so far. To start with, let's reverse the civilizing process. In 1939, a seminal text in European sociology arrived by a German sociologist called Norbert Elias. It's called the Civilizing Process, and it discusses how and why Europe became so safe. Unfortunately for Elias, this was the moment Europe, and especially Germany, took a big leap backwards in civility and started blowing each other up. Again. But World War II was essentially just one of two statistical outliers in what remains on average a very long period of rapidly declining violence. And when the book was republished again in the late 60s, it was widely and well received. The gist of it is that as Europe progressed from early hunter-gatherers and tribal societies through rival houses and into modern states, violence became more of a monopoly handed to a trusted entity and not something dished out by all folks as they deemed fit. Elias argues that the rise of these monopolies, coinciding with a deeper interconnectedness between peoples over longer distances, led to advancements in identifying with one another and a reduction in violence across the board, both between groups and within them. To put it simply, as Europe civilized, institutions like the police force, courts, and military owned by governments became the trusted mediators of conflict, and this created space for the rest of us commoners to live more peaceful lives of collaboration, eating with knives and forks, and wearing mercury face paint and powdered wigs. This is relevant to prehistoric war, only to give an opposing end to the spectrum of violence and the concept of a general trend in that direction. Civilization means different things in different contexts, but here it refers to the trend that Europe appeared to follow as states developed and violence, and therefore war, became centralized, ritualized, and reduced. So perhaps we can use this to extrapolate backwards, beyond written records, and discuss what war may have been like in a world with no formal national borders, tons of inherent threats from the environment, far less in the way of social structure, and a global human population in the low tens of thousands. Let's dig in. War today is steeped in politics, laws, and national interests. But if we expand the definition to mean any kind of organized, premeditated attacks on rival groups, we find that it predates all of these institutions significantly. In 2012, a discovery of fossilized human remains in Kenya gave us the early evidence of war that we know of at the time. They dated back 10,000 years. 27 very dead human beings from a Paleolithic hunter-gatherer society were found riddled with arrow, spear, and club wounds, inferred to have occurred as their group was set upon by multiple attackers. These wounds were horrific. Of the 8 women present, one of them was heavily pregnant and appeared to have had her hands bound before she was killed. A teenager and 5 kids under 6 years old were among them too. There were broken skulls, broken necks, broken ribs, and broken hands throughout the group. It's impossible to know if any of the captured escaped, but those who didn't were dumped in shallow water at the edge of a lagoon. What's particularly interesting about this find is it comes from a time when humans were thought to be nomadic, at least in this particular region. Small clusters of hunter-gatherers would not own land or territory and would not have had any meaningful quantity of possessions. The classic assumption had always been that war arose as human communities moved away from these primitive structures of wandering and towards more complex political institutions. And this find threw that assumption right out the window. Essentially, this discovery, known as the Nataruk site, hints at an uncomfortable reality. Brutal conflict is in our nature, and it likely always has been. As for the incentives, they may have varied. Some of the bladed tips found in the remains of these people were made of volcanic glass, obsidian. This material isn't found locally to Nataruk, and therefore suggests that attackers may have been marauding raiders from afar. And this discovery isn't an isolated one. There are 3 sites within just a few kilometers of it that show a common trend for the area. So humans were engaging in premeditated massacres of clusters of people at least 10,000 years ago. And as it turns out, this isn't the earliest evidence of such brutality either. Just a couple of countries north of Kenya, around the northern border of Sudan, evidence of a conflict that is tragically not dissimilar to the conditions in the region today, pushed the date of human warfare back to 13 or 14,000 years ago. Remains found at a site known as Jebel Sahaba appear to show a very different sort of conflict than what befell the Nataruk people. These are thought to be intergroup killings. The victims were roughly half male and half female, with just a few children involved. This site had been discovered in the 60s, but in 2021, new investigations made it the oldest known site of prehistoric war. The weapons and reasons appear to be different too. These were not hunter-gatherers, but peoples who had developed crop harvesting, and indeed some of the earliest to do so. And the region was experiencing rapid climate change, perhaps putting pressure on the high-density communities in times of food scarcity. The wounds on these victims this time were less blunt force impact and more the result of cutting weapons designed to cause bleeding. This competition for resources is a classic incentive for violence in all organisms, and the fact that the bodies found in Jebel Sahaba have many healed wounds in them suggests that violent attacks were just a way of life for these ancient people. And all this points to one of Elias's key observations, that a lack of structure or governance is inherently unstable and violent. And so it seems that the early agriculturalists were not sufficiently advanced in their society for them to have avoided a high probability of a brutal end. But what about the hunter-gatherers? They appeared to be living in a place of bountiful resources and little scarcity, and had nothing much of value to compete over. Surely they should have been spared from such a fate. Well, while scarcity can bring about violent competition, so can abundance. It's thought that in times of plenty, population densities can increase, and with higher densities and numbers comes increased chances for violence. In times of plenty, the human drive for ownership, power, and honor comes into play. So perhaps the people in Nataruk were simply victims of a brutal display of dominance by a clan hoping to gain more control over the region. We don't have to go all the way back to the Pleistocene to understand what tribal warfare may have looked like. Fortunately, there are still tribal communities around the world for us to learn from. The classic documentary Dead Birds has real video footage of a war fought by more or less Stone Age means, this time in West Papua. Two rival tribes meet in the open, chase one another, throw spears and shoot arrows, and generally erupt into a primal, noisy, and dangerous conflict. Remarkably, this ritualized warfare results in very few deaths, and this may tie into Elias's claim that the more official war becomes, the less suffering is caused. Perhaps over the 60,000 years or so of human presence in New Guinea, it became sensible to engage more in these ceremonial battles rather than the mutually destructive brutality of our ancestors. In Algeria, there's cave art from around 7,000 years ago that depicts a battle remarkably similar to that one in Papua. And in Australia, there's cave art that appears to depict scenes of massacres from 10,000 years ago, as if there wasn't enough already to defend against in prehistoric Australia. Early scholars appear to conclude that the lack of hierarchy in Aboriginal tribes meant that war for these people was not about dominance as such, but instead a matter of status within one's tribe. It would also have been a tool for raiding resources from rivals, stealing women, and engaging in vendettas. Regardless, battles in this part of the prehistoric world would have been fought by any of the men who were said to have all been expected to be warriors, and wounds would be inflicted by spears, boomerangs, axes, and clubs. Perhaps, as Elias may have thought, the egalitarian nature of a society can lend itself to more interpersonal violence, and this may have been the case elsewhere. Over in North America, in many native tribal conflicts, battles were often short and limited in casualties too, but not always. The Iroquois fought amongst themselves for centuries, and only stopped when it became useful to form a unified force to fight against the Cherokee, who themselves had been at war with surrounding tribes for generations. The scale of these conflicts varied, but ultimately the reality is that violence was a constant long before the Europeans came and made their mess of the place. Some tribes were more egalitarian and some far more hierarchical, and with over 500 tribes documented, it would be impossible to summarize tribal laws or draw any kind of argument towards which strategy would affect which level of violence. But one similarity between certain practices in North America and the ritualized wars in West Papua was the use of counting coup, in which a rival attempts to touch the enemy with a hand or a stick and escape unharmed. This is a great example of what Elias might have called a civilizing mechanism, with honor and ritual growing to replace lethal force. The intention to win prestige points and persuade the enemy they had lost didn't necessarily even require drawing blood. It's impossible to know how far back this lesson was learned, and when brute force may have given way to more symbolic ceremonial warfare. But what we do know is that war isn't a novel concept. In fact, it goes way back further than our own species. We're about to look at evidence of war that pushes the date back tens of thousands, perhaps even millions of years further. But just quickly before we do, it's time to thank you for watching this video and to point you in the direction of the channel, where you can find more like it. And if you enjoy them, hitting that like button will help us grow the channel more and keep making them, so thanks for that too. Perhaps the oldest evidence of Homo sapiens engaging in conflict is the remains of a Neanderthal who was stabbed by a modern human in what is now Iraq 50,000 years ago. At this time, it was thought that only Homo sapiens had projectile weapons of the kind found in the Neanderthal's rib, and therefore this becomes the most compelling evidence of interspecies warfare of the time. But we can go back even further than this. Neanderthal remains in many cases are riddled with brutal wounds, broken bones, crushed and pierced skulls, snapped ribs. Our closest human relatives lived equally, if not more, brutal lives than our own ancestors. One seemingly inconclusive find seems to be of a Neanderthal skull in Spain with a club hole in it from 430,000 years ago. This was, incidentally, more than twice as long ago as anatomically modern humans have existed. So as humans, Neanderthals were characteristically violent too. In fact, one estimate suggests that somewhere between 79% and 94% of Neanderthals sustained at least one severe traumatic injury in their lifetime. And they did this for hundreds of thousands of years. In fact, going back even as far as Australopithecus, before our genus had evolved, it's said that the strong brow ridges and thicker face bones seen in these species were an adaptation to being punched in the face and hit with things. That means throughout millions of years of hominid history, battles have raged so brutally that anyone with weak face bones was murdered out of the gene pool. And we don't have to imagine this entirely. Our closest relatives today aren't human species, but chimps. Chimp societies are far from egalitarian. Strict dominance hierarchies are created, maintained, and challenged with violence. Despite having complex coalitions and other social structures that are clearly relatable to us, chimps are notoriously brutal, and we have that on video too. In 1974, a political divide between a large group of chimps in Tanzania was documented reaching a tipping point when a separatist group ambushed and murdered a rival male. The group engaged in multiple similar raids with brutal effect, taking over the territory one assassination at a time. But this triggered a war between the groups that lasted more than 4 years. And it's not the only one. Footage from Uganda's Jebel forest shows that this behavior continues in other locations to this day. So, war and brutality are just in our genes, and these likely go back tens of millions of years. What perhaps makes us different, and may explain how many of our more modern examples of tribal warfare avoid some of this brutality, is that we've had hundreds of thousands of years of practice at becoming more restrained and gentler. In Elias's view, civilization doesn't just tame violence through the formation of states. It rewires us to feel shame and self-restraint through social conditioning, even when no one's watching. That wiring surely didn't exist to any meaningful degree in the assassins at Nataruk, who brutally murdered the family on the lake. One thing to bear in mind about Elias's The Civilizing Process is that it was not created to reinforce the idea that Europeans were somehow more civilized while other groups were savage and barbaric, but to really explore how and why Europeans held themselves in a higher regard as such, and the process by which they came to such a sense of cultural superiority. Still, its focus on the need for self-restraint in an ever-growing network of crowded, interconnected communities has never been more necessary, and if anything, the rise of violence that Europe is now facing does suggest that even given 500 years or more of the civilizing process, we're exceptionally predisposed to violence, and our propensity for war can see us backslide in a single generation or less. But the point also remains that in much of the developed world, at least, the level of violence experienced by the average resident of any country would be unthinkably low to our prehistoric counterparts. The world of prehistory was almost unfathomably brutal, and very few archaeological remains of these people showed anything close to the longevity that most of us enjoy today. Prehistoric life, as romantic as it may appear, was in most cases violent and short, and a substantial reason for this was our own species' inherent violent tendencies. While today's monopoly on violence certainly hasn't protected us from war, we are at significantly less risk of being bludgeoned by rampaging bands of murderers than ever before, and certainly than any time in prehistory. So while to some degree we have contained violence in our current social structures, we show no signs of eliminating it. But however you look at it, war in prehistory was far less predictable and far more ubiquitous. Caveman warfare was organized, rife, and personal, and it goes back well beyond our own human genes. The outstanding levels of intelligence and complex social structures exhibited by our ancestors and cousins only serve to bring about more clever and torturous ways of hurting one another. But it is these very same traits that give us the chance to dampen our instincts and choose a more self-aware future, where we can live with inclusivity, sustainability, and in peace. And if you'd like to hear more about Neanderthal life, check out our video on how these original people spent their days when they weren't brutalizing one another. That's all for this video. If you've enjoyed it, please consider subscribing to catch the next one, and we'll see you next time.